Afternoon. My name is Asim Shukla. I'm one of the co-founders of HAF, and also I serve on the board of directors. It's a pleasure for me also to personally welcome all of you as our next panel takes the stage. And I hope everyone appreciated the amount of work that Samir has put into this annual human rights report, now in its 14th year, I believe. The 14th human rights report. So next year will be the 15th annual human rights report. It's the only one of its kind that is produced internationally. It's quite a labor of work. It's an entire year's effort. Please do go to the website and see the full version of this as you read the abridged version in front of you. But now I'll ask you to set that aside as we transition into our next panel. It's been a pleasure for me personally to meet some of the panelists and now to introduce them to you. You've already met Samir, who will be moderating our discussion. Of course, Samir is based in our California offices in Northern California, and where we have a very large presence. HAF, as you know, has a large chapter there, and Samir has been quite busy with that as well. To his left is Seth Oldmixon. Seth is the founder of Liberty South Asia. In 2005, Seth moved to Bangladesh, where he lived in Joydepur and Comilla as a volunteer with the U.S. Peace Corps. This is, I just found out, was their honeymoon trip. He and his wife, this was their first trip, 4 months after marriage, moved to a small village in Bangladesh. It was here that he first met and fell in love with South Asia. And since returning to the U.S., he has worked with non-governmental organizations focused on promoting democracy and religious freedom in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. In 2015, he founded Liberty South Asia, which is a donor-funded organization that helps educate the public, the media, and government officials about issues related to religious liberty and political pluralism in that region. And particularly in Bangladesh, and from what you'll see in the report, is a crucial matter and very timely in these times. Last summer, Seth was invited to appear on MSNBC to help make sense of the tragic terrorist attack that you heard about in Dhaka, and his writing has been featured in The Hill, Foreign Policy, The National Interest, The Diplomat, The Cipher Brief, Scroll.in, as well as on several other foreign policy blogs and websites. And you can follow him on Twitter at Seth Oldmixon. To his left is Sushil Pandit. We're very fortunate to have him here in Washington, D.C., as he is based in New Delhi. He's a very well-known and respected advocate for the cause of Kashmiri Hindus. He's a co-founder of Roots in Kashmir, an organization mobilizing those Kashmiri Hindus who were either born or largely grew up after the exodus of 1990 that you heard Samir speak of. He's a practicing mass media professional and also teaches the subject. He studied at Delhi University and at Jawaharlal Nehru University in the 80s, and then worked with newspapers and global marketing communication networks before starting out on his own in 2000. And for those who have the interest later, do see some of the YouTube videos and the many lectures and talks that he's given. I had an opportunity to view some of them and learned an amazing new information that I really did not know from our daily conversations on the plight of Kashmiri Pandits, and to really understand the history. And to his left is Anita Wadhwani. She has been working for the Department of Defense for going on 10 years and currently serves as the India Country Director in the Office of Asian and Pacific Security Affairs. During her career, she has worked on key issues involving the South Asia region, to include counterterrorism, Islamic radicalization, and counterinsurgency. Anita previously deployed twice to Afghanistan and has also traveled to India, Bangladesh, and Nepal in the course of her work duties. Before starting at the DoD, she interned as a White House press corps reporter, covering foreign policy news under President Bush Jr. Anita received her master's in public and international affairs from the University of Pittsburgh and her bachelor's in journalism and mass communications from Point Park University, both of which are in Pittsburgh. So thank you and welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much, Asim, and welcome to all of you again for our second panel of the day. This is unlike our earlier panel, which is focused on domestic policy issues. We're going to do a little bit of foreign policy discussion here, and particularly the subject of terrorism in South Asia. What are some of the emerging international security threats in the region? And more importantly, how can U.S. policymakers effectively address these threats? And we're very pleased to be joined by these esteemed panelists. And what I want our panelists to really give our audience a sense of today are, from our perspective as delegates, what should we know about these emerging threats? What as Hindu Americans can we do to better educate our policymakers on that? And what should we be advising our members of Congress, our representatives on the pertinent issues and how to effectively address them? I will say that our panel will be in the same format as this morning's panel. So we'll have each of our panelists have the opportunity to give about 10 minutes of opening remarks. And then we'll have a moderated question and answer where you'll have the index cards on each of your chairs, and the volunteers will collect those index cards. Once the moderated discussion is completed, our panelists will have a chance to give some final closing remarks and thoughts, and then we'll wrap up the panel with that. So I'd like to first turn to Seth Oldmixon, who's the founder of Liberty South Asia. Seth, if you could talk a little bit about the situation, particularly in Bangladesh and Pakistan. We've seen a lot of attention focused on Syria and the Middle East with the rise of radical groups, terrorism, ISIS, obviously. If you could talk a little bit from the South Asian perspective of what's happening there, particularly with a focus on these two countries.
Sure. Absolutely, Samir, and thanks for inviting me to do this. It's an interesting question, and looking at the trends, especially with regards to extremism and terrorist attacks, there's a big question. If you ask ISPR in Pakistan, for example, they'll be very glad to tell you that the trend is down and that terrorist attacks are down. The military operations, Zarbiyan and Radul Fasad have taken care of things. The militants have had their backs broken and they're on the run. Unfortunately, the militants continue to attack. Some of the question is around how terrorist attacks are really defined anyways. Some of them are obvious to us. When somebody detonates a suicide vest at an Easter celebration, we know that's a terrorist attack. But what about last year when a 35-year-old Hindu businessman was accused of blasphemy in Pakistan and a riot broke out? It was a riot that ended up killing, I believe, a 10-year-old child. Is that a terrorist attack? Many in the Pakistani official circles will tell you, no, it's a law and order situation. Similar things happen in Bangladesh. If a Hindu priest is murdered in a machete attack, that's generally seen as a terrorist attack. But if you look at around the elections, you don't even have to look around elections, actually. You can go back to last year in Brahmanbaria, where you had Hindus being attacked, their families being attacked, their homes and businesses burned to the ground. Was that a terrorist attack? In fact, that question has been raised about that particular attack because it turned out to be an attack that was orchestrated in order to steal the Hindus' land. It was orchestrated in order to drive them off of their land by local political leaders. Depending on how you define terrorism, that's either a terrorist attack or another law and order situation. Unfortunately, we don't have a commonly agreed upon definition of terrorism. From our point of view at Liberty South Asia, these all qualify. These are terrorist attacks, and they must be treated as such. In that light, terrorist attacks and extremism are certainly up in Bangladesh. I think that's generally agreed upon. In Pakistan, while there have been maybe a reduction in mass casualty attacks, there certainly by no means have stopped. And we continue to see smaller scale attacks that are, again, categorized as law and order problems. Now this, I think, raises a question of who is responsible, who are the groups that are carrying these things out. This is something where I think we have a tendency to get caught up in an alphabet soup of organization names and I think miss a lot of the bigger picture. Some of the most important extremist and militant groups, especially in South Asia, are not ones that are household name terrorist groups. We hear about AQIS, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. We hear about ISIS. But more and more of the grassroots extremism and the attacks that are taking place are being supported by groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba. Lashkar-e-Taiba we tend to think about as focused on Kashmir, although Lashkar-e-Taiba is operative in Afghanistan. Lashkar-e-Taiba is actually also operative in Syria. Lashkar-e-Taiba is operative in Gaza. And you don't have to have any sort of special security clearance to know about this. They brag about it. If you follow their social media feeds, they will be happy to tell you. The other group is not even considered, it's not even a designated, Lashkar-e-Taiba has at least been designated a terrorist group by the United Nations. But then you have the case of Jamaat-e-Islami, which you mentioned earlier. Jamaat-e-Islami is, depending on who you talk to, a moderate religious political party. Pro tip, they're not. Or they're a cultural group. They're not that either. You find Jamaat-e-Islami not only lobbying in Washington, D.C. In fact, Jamaat-e-Islami has spent millions of dollars in the past couple of years lobbying in Washington, D.C., little known fact. Not all of it properly disclosed. But you find them also with very curious ties to a lot of the more well-known Islamist militant terrorist groups. In Bangladesh, in particular, you have JMB, is the very well-known indigenous Islamist militant group. JMB was founded by someone who had a very interesting background. He had participated in the Afghan jihad. He had studied Islam in Saudi Arabia. It was there that he met members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, another not terrorist organization, just to be clear. As the Secretary of State recently explained, it would be too complicated to make that designation. After meeting with the Muslim Brotherhood, he decided he wanted to launch an armed jihad in Bangladesh. So he went to Pakistan, where he trained with Lashkar-e-Taiba. Lashkar-e-Taiba trained him in weapons and strategy. He went back to Bangladesh, and then, the rest is history, as they say. And it's a history that continues. In fact, the domestic militant groups in Bangladesh, like JMB, their primary international contact has always been with Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan. That's where they get resources, that's where they get support, and that's where they get training. Part of the reason that I think it's problematic to talk too much about these individual groups, though, is that it misses the point that these groups do not operate as siloed individual organizations. ISIS especially has completely revolutionized this. Every time there's an attack and ISIS talks about it, and then people ask, well, is this person really an ISIS member? Is ISIS really involved? And the problem is that is looking at these groups in a very old-fashioned way. And it's looking at them in a way that you had to go somewhere geographically. You had to go through really an application process. You had to be inducted. You had to go through all of this formality. Today, these groups really operate more like individual outposts or embassies that are responsible for particular geographic or political outcomes. So while Lashkar-e-Taiba may be, focused on Kashmir for now, as we were discussing earlier, the jihadi groups in Kashmir have started to say, look, yes, Kashmir now, but Pakistan's next. We're not done here. This isn't our final goal. they have shared goals, they have shared members, they have shared resources. JMB is not the same as Lashkar-e-Taiba, and yet there are direct connections between the two. Why? Because they have shared outcomes. They have a long-term view of the way that the world should be shaped, and they are working towards that common view. They may argue about different things internally, but at the end of the day, they're all working towards that, that same goal. Like I said, ISIS revolutionized this because they created a distributed form of jihad. If you read the ISIS literature, which I don't recommend, but if you do, which is easy because it's in English and it's all over the internet, ask yourself, why is a terrorist group, a militant group that is focused on Syria, putting out very slick English language magazines on the internet? It's because they're not focused on Syria. They're focused on the world. And in their literature, they say very specifically, you don't have to come to Syria to join the jihad. You don't, there was an article in one issue where they said, here are a list of 10 things you can do. The first thing was they said, you can sell everything you have, cash it all out, come to Syria, and join this armed fight here. Maybe you can't do that. Go down the list. Further down the list, you saw you can rent a truck and drive it into a crowd of people. Everyone thought, oh, this is just outrageous. Until we started seeing trucks being driven into crowds of people. Not in Syria, in London. You go further down the list, and they said, look, maybe you're a student. Maybe you're in high school. Here are some stickers that you can print out and post them up around town. Put them on the bus. Spread the message. Let people know. So what ISIS has done, if you say, well, is this person a member of ISIS? Well, they've never gone to Syria. They don't know anyone. They've never received any formal training. What does it mean to be a member of ISIS? They've completely changed the paradigm on this. So when we talk about trends, are terrorist attacks up? Who are the groups involved? It's much more complicated. The last thing I would touch on are, so what do we do about it, right? Especially here in the U.S. And I think that there are sort of three buckets that I like to put things in. The first one is we can enforce laws that we already have, and really pressure officials to enforce the laws that they've already passed. In one glaring case, military aid for Pakistan is supposed to be contingent upon Pakistan demonstrating that they have taken action to stop militant groups, some of them specifically named, including Haqqani Network and Lashkar-e-Taiba, stop them from operating in Pakistan. Pakistan says, there's no more militant groups in Pakistan. We have no safe havens. The ambassador recently said this. 3 days later, a Haqqani Network militants were killed by a CIA drone strike in Pakistan. How did they get there? A month before that, Pakistan had said, we have completely cleared out the Haqqani Network militants from Pakistan. But the aid continues to go. So we don't have credibility. If we don't have credibility, if we're not willing to use the carrots and sticks, no one's going to take us seriously. A next bucket is providing technical assistance. And in this way, I'm actually a big proponent of providing non-security technical assistance in ways that can change things. Samir, a lot of the stuff that you talked about in the Human Rights Report, those are opportunities for the U.S. to really come in and protect people in those countries by doing things. And here's an example that I like to use, land grabbing. We see over and over again attacks are carried out, orchestrated to steal people's land. Part of the reason that this is possible is not only the religious extremism that people take advantage of, but that record keeping, let's be honest, is non-existent. So being able to prove that you're the owners of this land, especially if it's been in the family for centuries, is nearly impossible. The United States was founded by land surveyors. Our entire country, if we know one thing, it's property ownership documentation. And this is an area that we can go in and we can provide technical assistance. It's not security related. It's not guns. It's not wiretaps. It's just saying, let us help you get these records in order. That takes away the incentive. If these people know, look, even if we attack them, even if we accuse them of blasphemy or whatever and get a mob riled up, we're not going to be able to get the land. It takes away that motive, that opportunity. And the last thing I would say is we have to be a city on a hill. We have to be a shining example at home of demonstrating that religious freedom and tolerance and inclusivity works. That is the biggest threat, I think, to these extremist groups.
Well, thank you so much, Seth, for providing that perspective. We already have some questions for you, but I think I'm going to hold off for a little while, let our other speakers talk. So now I'd like to turn to our second panelist, Sushil Pandit, who, thank you again for being with us today, who has a very unique perspective on the situation in Kashmir. If you could talk a little bit about what's been happening there, and maybe what people are missing in the international media or outside of India, and if you could provide a little bit of an assessment of some of the recent violence and unrest there.
For this opportunity, Samir. I would like to preface the details about recent events with a slight bit of context, a background to it. The 1990 exodus that you mentioned, Hindus from Kashmir Valley, was actually the 7th exodus in the last 5.5 centuries. The previous 6 exoduses took place till 1819, when the Islamist rule ended in Kashmir. Those 6 exoduses were no less painful. It was, in fact, an unabated genocide, which reduced Kashmiri Hindu population from 100% in the valley to very low double digits, just about 15%. But what hurts the most is the 7th exodus that took place in 1990. Why? Because the previous 6 exoduses took place under an alien rule. We were ruled by those who came from outside, who didn't believe in the ethos and culture of the land. And for them, the natives were a source of threat, probably, and enemies. And you could probably take heart in the fact that you could blame your fate and get on with it. The 7th exodus happened in a secular, democratic, constitutional order, which was led by people elected by us, which was sworn to Human Rights Declaration of 1948, United Nations. It happened in this day and age when everyone, not just in Kashmir, not just around, but across the world, knew what was happening. And it was allowed to happen. And we had nobody to blame. That is the context of this exodus. But even worse is the fact that it is continuing. It hasn't stopped. There aren't too many soft targets or sitting ducks as there were till 1990. But they have graduated to harder targets. The reason is because there is no reversal of genocide. There is no retributory justice. There is no criminal justice system that would account for these crimes. There is an indifferent state. And not just indifferent, I would sometimes feel that it is complicit. Because if the state begins to curry favor with genociders, tries to win them over by applying them with security, with facilities, with a status, then you can kiss goodbye to any justice ever. Because those who were accused of heinous crimes like murder, rape, massacres, usurping of property, desecration of temples, they are masquerading as heroes of a so-called freedom struggle. And you see the state and its apparatus and its functionaries mollycoddling them, treating them with great deal of honor, respect, and status. And that is when they grow the gumption to either sometimes brag about what they did, or when cornered in a public discourse or a debate, blatantly deny it, simply just with a straight face deny it and call it a lie, and go about their business very secure in the fact that nothing's going to ever happen to them. So this is the context in which whatever is happening in Kashmir continues to happen. There are three dimensions to the jihad that is being conducted in Kashmir. Or for that matter, anywhere in South Asia. It is very organized. Organized to the extent of being institutional. And when I say institutional, what I mean is that there is some kind of a mandate, presumed, either divine or through the scriptures, which has wide sanction within the society. There are people who agree to it, who support it, some actively, some passively. And then there are organizations. In Pakistan, as Seth just mentioned, these organizations have state patronage, often state funding, and they are used as means of foreign policy. In Kashmir, these organizations are dealt with very carefully. And it's a given that they operate at three levels. At the very basic level, there is insurgency, which is armed with sophisticated weapons, sometimes more sophisticated than the security forces who take them on. Lethal, very well organized, with a lot of technology to back. Well, since it is a straight rebellion and call to arms, therefore security forces deal with them. At the second level, there is the overground face of the underground, which is the organizations who espouse their cause and call them their boys, who justify what is being done by these boys in the name of whatever struggle they wage, and who provide the ideological cover, some kind of a sanction. It is possible to even politically deal with them by questioning their motives, by even questioning their ways, by holding their past as a mirror to them and say, there's a lot of hypocrisy going on there. Especially the way they keep their families out of harm's way and get the local poor populace to face the brunt of this movement. Till this level, one can see a certain degree of candor and openness about what you're doing. Insurgents have taken to arms, and the separatists have taken to a certain ideology. But what is more insidious and lethal is the third dimension. And that is those so-called mainstream parties who ostensibly operate under the oath of Indian Constitution, who swear by the democratic process, who contest elections and somehow, therefore, call themselves legitimate. But what they in turn do is to operate in coordination with the other two. And it stands to reason, because they know the other two are openly defying the state, one violently and another not so violently. The state has a responsibility to defend itself, so it will respond to such challenges. It will respond to violent insurgency through its security forces. It will respond to violation of law through the laws available to itself. But state's ability to defend itself and respond to these violations is thwarted by the third arm, which through elections gets into the power, wields the levers of power and instrumentalities of the state, and from within the state weakens the will to take on this challenge. In any given encounter, the government, the state government in the state of Jammu and Kashmir is never seen standing with the security forces. They go and commiserate with the terrorist families. They very often denounce the police force that has taken on these militants, saying that excessive force was used. Forewarnings were not given. We were not told that such and such militant is cornered in such and such county. So delegitimize a very legitimate work that the state security forces do. Create such policies which come in the way of an effective security force operation and provide cushion to terror. I'll give you a small example. There is a government order called SRO 43, under which the employees of the state government, when they die premature in their service, the state government offers some ex gratia compensation to the families of such employees and on compassionate terms offers a state government job to the most deserving within the family according to the qualification of a person. This is obviously meant to look after the government servants. The earlier chief minister, father of the present chief minister in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, proposed and got this policy decision ratified, that the terrorists who die in the operations conducted by the security forces are also young ones of the families who can't be blamed for their terrorist activities. How can we blame these families? If a boy turns terrorist, if a guy takes two guns and goes away, he is a loss to the family. And since he's lost to the family which lives in the state, which is part of the state, it is government's job to reach out to such a family as part of their healing touch and reaching out policy. And why shouldn't the benefits of SRO 43 be extended to such a family? You tell me, will families send soldiers for security operations? Or will they produce militants to wage a war against the state? But this is how state's will is subverted by those who come to wield the powers of the state through democratic process, pledging their allegiance to the Constitution. And create a bizarre situation. So it seems the state itself seems to be subverted from within. Civil society organizations have been subverted from within. I'll give you another example. There is a man called Abdul Qayyum. He's the chairman of the Bar Association of the state of the province of Kashmir within the state of Jammu and Kashmir. He tells a high court judge to his face that I don't believe in this constitution, I care two hoots for it. And the judge reminds him that his license to practice is predicated on his oath of allegiance to this constitution, and his license can be revoked. And he dares the judge to do his worst. Gets away with it. The judge can't do a thing. He's still there, president of the Bar Association. Just a few months back, less than 2 months back, he invoked Supreme Court to deny even pellet guns to security forces who are faced with lethal weapons like AK-47 or grenade launchers. So such is the perversion prevailing within the system. In such a state of affairs, looking for justice to those who are victims and survivors of genocide 28 years ago seems like a dream, a fantasy. Let me tell you, not one murder, not one rape out of thousands committed, not one abduction, not one desecration of temple has been punished in the last 28 years. Not one, even as an exception. So it seems that the criminal justice system is completely collapsed. And not just this, you have the sight of those very criminals masquerading as heroes and setting the terms for people who want to come back to their homes. And because all this has gone unpunished, there is an extra premium. Rampaging mobs, continuing terror, and violation of law. That is where we are. It's not just in Kashmir, as I mentioned. This asymmetrical war is right now raging throughout the subcontinent, including India. There is an organization called TNTJ in Tamil Nadu. It's called Tamil Nadu Tawheed Jamaat. They account for almost 36 murders of Hindu activists in the state of Tamil Nadu. Political activists, social activists, community activists, RSS workers, Hindu Munani workers. And each one of these murders till date has gone unsolved and unpunished. A major filmmaker like Kamala Hassan, his film Vishwarupam, despite being approved by the censor board, couldn't be exhibited. And he had to go sit in negotiation with TNTJ, who chopped the film's different portions that, incidentally, I mean, it will be funny for you to hear. This film was about terrorism, and it showed a bunch of Taliban activists praying in a mosque and then picking up the guns and going on a mission to shoot and bomb. They didn't object to the fact that how can someone pray in the mosque and then go for such a mission? They had a more fundamental question for him. He says, how can you depict Taliban as terrorists? He says, please take the entire seal off. And he asked the chief minister to provide protection. He said, listen, my film has been approved by the regular process. He says, but you have to deal with them. He says, why don't you provide security? She says, there are about 5,500 cinema halls. I can't provide security at each cinema hall. He says, you don't have to provide at each cinema hall. This is 5.5% population of the state, maximum 16% at Ambur. So you have to only see the trouble spot approach. She says, no. The same state provides protection to 26,000 liquor vends with police, but will not provide basic security or arrest key troublemakers, detain them. Force a person like Kamal Hassan to go and negotiate with them. And this man was caught on tape in a sting operation bragging how he negotiated with Kamal Hassan. He said, I just told him that when Mani Ratnam's house was bombed, he was lucky the bomb did not explode. But this time we'll make sure that it's not just one but half a dozen bombs and each one of them explodes. And he was willing to cut whatever we asked him. The state has given in. It doesn't enforce law, but it makes deals. It buys peace. It makes concessions. It gets into negotiations. That has become the nature of the state. In Pakistan, if the state is in cahoots, in India, in several provinces, and at the center, the state wants to sit down and ask you, what is your problem with people who are carrying bombs? A state which is sworn to Human Rights Declaration of United Nations. Sometimes I feel in 1948, the Organization of Islamic Countries refused to sign that Human Rights Declaration because it said it is not compliant with our Islamic law. I think there was some honesty there, because instead of being hypocrites, where you sign the declaration and do not do anything to enforce it in your system, here are a bunch of states who says we do not believe in these human rights, we'll evolve our own, and by 1952 they had a conference in Jeddah and they evolved their own set of human rights. So what do we do with states who do not adhere to a system of criminal justice system that they have given themselves? That is where the crux of the problem is, and when you say what can American policymakers do, I must tell you, India has, in the last 3 decades, tried 2 terror laws. Both have had to go, TADA and POTA. We are perhaps the largest victim of terror in the world, I dare say, and we don't have a terror law to deal with terrorism. Number 2, there is a genocide which was recorded by National Human Rights Commission in '94, headed by Justice Venkatachalaya, who used the word, what happened to Kashmiri Hindus was akin to genocide. I don't know why he used the word akin, but he says akin to genocide. That genocide remains. Hasn't been reversed, hasn't been punished. So there's no wonder that it continues, not only there, but has begun to happen in other parts of the world, of the country. In the absence of a robust criminal justice system that punishes such crimes, that punishes terrorists, I don't see any relief or any slowing down of this process. It is hastening its gathering pace. So the future seems grim. As one of the largest democracies, or the most powerful democracies in the world, and as a growing partner with India in strategic affairs, I sometimes wonder, should it be my remit to ask another state government, another state, another nation, to come and ask my national government to do what it ought to be doing themselves? It isn't my remit. But if there is a process through which people and governments are audited for their performance on human rights, record, punishing genocide, punishing terror, dealing with terror organizations, that process ought to be constituted, and informally, if possible, through wink and nudge, if possible. If such a pressure is brought upon, it will only bring relief and some sanity in what is happening in Kashmir and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you for that very honest assessment, and unfortunately, as you put it, very grim assessment of the situation there. I wanted to turn now to our final panelist, Anita Wadhwani, to give us her perspective from the Department of Defense perspective on some of the overarching challenges in South Asia, and specifically what the Department of Defense views as some of the solutions to these issues.
Sure. I can speak to my experience at DoD. I can't speak on behalf of my senior principal, so I'll just get that out of the way. As noted before, I've worked a lot on radicalization. I just want to also thank everyone for being here, thank HAF as well for having me. But radicalization, it has a lot of different terminology. When I worked at the National Counterterrorism Center on detail from DoD, the definition we used was the process by which individuals come to believe that their engagement in or facilitation of non-state violence to achieve social and political change is necessary and justified. So that's the definition we looked at, and radicalization, the biggest threat I think in South Asia as well as around the world is self-radicalization. And we've looked at the way extremist media messaging works and ways to combat it. Now, and I know it was mentioned in a few other bits of dialogue earlier, but when we look at militant messaging, we look at content, we look at the medium that's used, and we look at the influence that it provides. When we look at global jihad, we look at obviously the main groups as noted earlier, but we do see the involvement and sophistication of the content and the mediums. We've seen them not only in English languages, but in Urdu, in Hindi, in Bengali. So the South Asia gamut is very taken up by in sophistication in this media messaging, which goes a long way. One of the key things I think that is of concern when you look across South Asia is two things. The isolation of communities, both in Muslim majority countries and non-Muslim majority countries. Now, in the course of my work, the way to really understand ideology is you have to really think and sort of live it a little bit, understand the behaviors, understand the psychology of what makes somebody radicalized. Because it's not one standard formula for everyone, or for every group, and it's not one goal set for every group as well. So we see those various isolations. For example, when I went to Kathmandu back in 2014, the Nepalese had actually requested us to go there and talk to them about the process of radicalization. At that time, and still now, they do not have a radicalization problem per se. However, there was a lot of concern about Muslim groups on the border and in smaller other areas, villages, etc. And one of the key things we spoke to them about was, you want to keep those communities integrated, because as soon as you isolate those communities, as soon as there's no integration with the security forces, and so on, that is when you're going to see, the vacuum being picked up by other groups, other recruiters, things like that. And that's what we're seeing all along the South Asia dynamic. One of the key things with India is that, we always get questions about, well, why does India not have a mass radicalization problem? And I think it's a variety of reasons. Kashmir aside, the rest of India, you do see little pockets here and there of issues. You've seen a few ISIS claimed attacks this year. However, we do not see mass numbers as we've seen in Europe, for example, and elsewhere, seeking the cause of ISIS. And why is that? Well, for India, we have several religions that live there, that have lived there for, since the creation. So, for hundreds of years, we've seen some type of integration of religions, especially now. And given the local dynamics, yes, there are disenfranchised elements across the board, but you see that with Hindu communities as well as Muslim communities. The type of Islam that we see, that caters to those who want to radicalize is a takfir ideology that's, mainly from the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Wahhabism. That has not really taken a strong foothold per se in India. And even Afghanistan, we talk about ISIS in Nangarhar, which is very correct, but why is it not expanded there? When ISIS first came to Nangarhar, we saw beheadings, we saw a lot of violence against the local population there. And when you come in as an outside group, and start attacking the local population, that ideology is not really going to be accepted. And it wasn't accepted. The media, the local Afghan press, was very quick to display the vices of ISIS, KP, and Khorasan province, as it's known as. And I think that went a long way to showing that this type of ideology doesn't have a place where it can gain widestream, acceptance. With that said, that is still a strong warning for the whole region to not let Afghanistan become that permissive environment where elements like these can grab a foothold and spread further. So, so back to those communities that we want to try to integrate with our local security forces and our local government forces, and keep that stability as much as we can. Now, we see that in small cases around the U.S. with our communities and the Islamic communities here. So I think that is one of the key tools that we try to use as far as trying to prevent that type of ideology or radicalization from spreading. The other issue that we often face when we look at radicalization around South Asia is basically this quickness to absorb propaganda and this lack of wanting to verify. So when you look at conspiracy theory, for example, it can be very abundant depending on what country you look at. For example, we did a lot of work with Pakistan, looking at Pakistan, I should say, not directly with Pakistan, but when you look at what's going on there, you see a variety of conspiracy theories, you name it, we have to sort of look at and deal with, and take the very media-focused example of Malala Yousafzai. Now here is somebody who was a strong activist who got shot, and we all know the story. But very interestingly enough, we sort of say only in Pakistan could you see this story play out where she's become the enemy of the state. And we actually took an example and looking at it as a case study of how did this happen. The conspiracy theories there just lended itself, and people did not question it. When members of TTP, Tariq Taliban of Pakistan, would go out into the media and launch a video or launch a letter in the press countering whatever Malala Yousafzai said, people actually believed the TTP terrorists were attacking the nation state versus Malala Yousafzai. So when you really step back and think about it, it's pretty shocking, but they did, win the propaganda victory within the Pakistani state. Obviously, they did not win that outside of it, but it's very difficult for her to ever come back there, for her to ever be accepted, for her family to ever be accepted by the local population there. So that's where you see just this mentality to not question things, this mentality to quickly absorb propaganda and not have a verification of where it's coming from. And that goes back to how important media messaging and looking at extremist messaging really is. One of the key things that we have dealt with is looking at ways to counter this. And unfortunately, in the South Asia realm, it's very difficult. It hasn't been a lot of progress when you look at counter narratives, when you look at strategic messaging by the governments. Afghanistan for a long time had a detrimental problem with having a cohesive strategic narrative, and I personally believe it still really doesn't. When you look at the Taliban's media propaganda there, they have their own website. It's in 4 or 5 different languages. It comes out with statements on attacks. It comes out with statements on what's going on in the U.S. political climate, in the world stage, on things going on in the world. The Taliban comes out with a statement. The Taliban there come out with an e-statement that the IC and the DoD and various elements of the government look at very closely, because what that provides is the Taliban wrap-up of what's going on in the past year, and it sort of also lines up what they're perspective is, what their ideology is, how they'll move forward. Now, yes, elements of this is propaganda, but it also provides insight on how they view how well they're doing. There's some truth to it. So that's the other challenge of when you look at militant media. You have to decipher, what's complete propaganda and falsehoods and means of influence versus what's reality as far as how they perceive things and how they view things ongoing or in the future. So there is that fine balance. Vice versa, when you look at the Afghan government, they don't put out an e-statement talking about how good the security forces are doing. They don't, and that's not to say they don't do some elements of trying to lift up the purview of the security forces in a small local level, but you don't see that playing out in a strong dynamic on the national level, which is what you really need to combat this type of thing. So that's the Afghan example there. In Bangladesh, we've seen extremism take a stronger role, and we've seen it with all these killings of the bloggers, etc. Has there been a really strong counter-narrative by the government? There's been, and I'm sure the panelists can adhere to this as well, you just see more of a tit for tat, you see random statements by the government, but you don't see a well-rehearsed or at least a well-laid-out counter-narrative to a lot of what's going on there. And that's a country where you see a lot of isolated communities, a lack of governance, a variety of things. But back in the day, when you look at national security issues, when you look at counterterrorism issues, it used to be thought that the socioeconomic dynamics are what made young men, for example, join terrorism groups. That's the case at times, but then you see rich families and well-off, educated men and women at times supporting these movements. And how do you counter that? So there's a variety of different elements there that requires a lot of in-depth thinking, a lot of in-depth review, a lot of looking at the various demographics, and really taking a hard look. This is not an easy problem to solve, but we need to use at least some of the tools that the militant, the jihadist movement, and other things are using. Now, the State Department here has tried and is continuing to do a communication means where they go on Twitter and they sort of use counter-narratives directly on some of these groups. That can only really go so far. I mean, that does sort of inhibit some levels of recruitment on a very tactical level. But something widespread that I'm talking about really has to have the governments of those countries involved and has to have specific people with that type of savviness. When you look at corporations and things like that, like some of these big corporations, for example, that have elements, Apple, Google, Twitter itself, Facebook, and others, that's where we can utilize those groups to sort of help with establishing a counter-narrative using some elements of either other local companies or working with the direct government itself. So that's just what I wanted to touch on. I mean, as I mentioned, it is a big issue. Self-radicalization is not something that we can, obviously control even here in the United States, but it's a strong threat there. And I think as far as the region's concerned, the stability of Afghanistan is very detrimental, more so for the region than it is for us, because they have to deal with the refugee crises. They have to deal with, especially India, would have to deal with attacks happening at the Indian consulates in Afghanistan, then across the border, those would increase. And it would just go on from there. So I'll leave it at that as another grim situation. But there are elements where I think we can work to sort of get at the problem.
Thank you very much. It seems like this is turning out to be a rather depressing panel. But I think now we have some time to get some questions from the audience. So again, same process. We should have index cards. Please do find your volunteers and hand those to the volunteers. But while we're waiting, I wanted to actually just start by asking a couple questions. Seth, starting with you, you touched on Jamaat-e-Islami's effectiveness, not just in messaging, but also their lobbying apparatus, or the use of lobbyists here in the U.S., and I think that in the UK they've done that effectively as well. How have they been able to convince policymakers that they or put this moderate sheen on themselves? And what is it that policymakers why are they willing to buy into that? I mean, what are they doing so effectively that's convincing policymakers that they're actually the ones that are being oppressed? And it's the Awami League that is the one. No doubt the Awami League has committed atrocities and has repressed, has suppressed political dissent, etc. But how would they convince policymakers that they're the true victims in all of this?
Sure. I think that the answer is two-part. The first part is what is really an unfortunate own goal scored by the Awami League with the way that the International Crimes Tribunal, which is the war crimes court that was established to try the cases from 1971, has played out. Now, there was, when the Awami League announced that if elected, this was an election, a campaign promise, if elected, we're going to establish these war crimes tribunals, and we're finally going to bring people to justice and bring some closure. It was a demand that was overwhelmingly supported by the Bangladeshi people. It swept the Awami League into power. What it has been somewhat forgotten is that groups like Human Rights Watch and a lot of other human rights groups supported the ICT. They said, they gave tacit support. They said, we'd like to see how this plays out, but this is good. We would like to see, there were human rights atrocities committed in 1971, grievous ones. Now, the unfortunate side of it, what happened over the next few years, is that there were procedural questions that were raised. I'm not an attorney, so I'm not qualified to evaluate the different procedural objections that were raised. Suffice it to say, there were a number of questions raised about due process and about the process under which the ICT was operating. The answer that was usually given was, stay out of our business, this is something that the people want, and we're going to keep moving on with it. This soured everybody in the international, particularly the human rights community, on the ICT. So moving forward, as you saw Jamaat leaders begin to be convicted and executed, you saw a lot of outcry from the human rights community against these convictions and executions. The objections were overwhelmingly procedural objections. So these are legal questions. They would say, we're not saying these guys are innocent. We're not saying they didn't commit these atrocities, but in order to have a proper trial and a proper conviction, we need to have the ICT adhere to certain international norms. Jamaat-e-Islami seized on this. Now, Jamaat-e-Islami has extremely well-educated lawyers among their ranks. There's this idea that I think a lot of us have, where we like to think of our religious extremists as guys living in caves, right? We like to think of people who were orphans who got unfortunately stuck in some terrible madrasa and brainwashed. Now they're unkept and they're cave dwellers. This is not the case. In fact, the evidence overwhelmingly has moved in the opposite direction, and more not just anecdotally, but statistically, we're seeing that engineers, in particular, but educated people are drawn, can be, and are drawn to violent extremism. Lawyers can also be, no offense to any lawyers in the room, but are susceptible. The Jamaat Islami's lawyers.
I'm a lawyer.
The Jamaat Islami's lawyers saw this opportunity to make a PR campaign out of it, and it worked. Now, part of what made that PR campaign so productive was they spent a lot of money on lobbyists, professional lobbyists. Complicated and hard to argue. They also understood another very important thing. The U.S. is tired of being in Afghanistan, and we don't want another one. So how do we make Bangladesh go away, right? When I've met with people on the Hill, and you'll find this as you talk to people. Number one, they couldn't tell you where Bangladesh is, most of them, and they're weary. There's too much. Afghanistan is already seen as how do we get out of here. Pakistan sucks up all the air in the room in Washington, D.C. And the last thing that anyone wants to be told is, hey, you know how Pakistan is turning into Afghanistan? Well, guess what? We've got another Pakistan in the wings too, right? So they want it to go away. They want an easy solution. The Jamaat Islami lawyers can go in and they can say, here's the thing. All they have to do is muddy the waters. Because the U.S. isn't going to do anything about it. All they have to do is they have to get Congress not to do anything, and then they can take care of the situation on the ground, right? So that's what's going on.
So our next question is for Anita. Anita, how much do you find the legitimate issue of Islamophobia here in the U.S. impacting your work in tackling self-radicalization around the world?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say Islamophobia, in my circles, I don't really come across it. I come across more of just a lack of understanding of maybe the different nuances, but there is definitely a willingness to learn and have some type of understanding in order to work on radicalization issues. Now, sometimes there's a lot of overgeneralization going on, and TTP and the Taliban, aren't they the same thing? So we've worked, back when I was at the National Counterterrorism Center, we did a lot of work domestically going to law enforcement and elsewhere and sort of talking to them about, the various differentiations of what radicalization is and how one ideology may be a little different than the other, and so extremism is obviously a variation of mainstream Islam. So, but there was never, at least from what I encountered, a strong resistance to learning and understanding about radicalization and Islam itself.
And just as a follow-up, have you, through these programs to kind of counter self-radicalization, have you been seeing any results? You talked about the messaging on the other side being very effective, but are there any positive results that you can maybe share in terms of what the impact has been of U.S. spending or U.S. policy on these self-radicalization issues specifically?
Sure. Yeah, I think obviously it would be more of a cumulative type of issue there. So when President Obama had the CVE summit a few years ago and brought in a lot of different elements within government and outside government, that really kicked off. That at the time was seen as kicking off this great initiative, but that was something that all these agencies, especially NCTC at that time, had been working on for quite some time, had been getting behavioral psychologists, had been writing manuals that it had been briefing not only in country, but to our allies and partners globally. And I think just providing that awareness and getting something like that together to sort of move further, I think that in itself was a level of success. And then, you see it with smaller communities that we've done outreach to. There's an understanding of integrating with the local communities, not only with the local mosques, but with the local, Hindu temples and with the other non-Christian elements in American society, to just have a better understanding and awareness of what's going on in local communities, mainly in high school and recreational communities where the youth is more vulnerable. So I know we've done a lot of that in towards Northern Virginia, Fairfax, things like that. We've done it in Texas. We've done it in various areas, California, for example. So I think that type of work, it's always hard to prove a positive when nothing actually happens. So but the fact that there has been consistent outreach on those levels, I think that's, and you haven't seen negative activity. And if you look at the U.S. as a whole, a lot of these cumulative efforts working with Homeland Security, FBI, and all that, we haven't had another 9/11. We haven't had these other mass coordinated attacks. There has, in my personal opinion, been a lot of effective means of warding off terrorism locally, and we're just trying to sort of give that skill base to more localized elements abroad. So I think that's where you see some of those successes.
This next question is for Sushil. Sushil, I know you mentioned a little bit about some of the roadblocks or the problems in India in terms of the weakness of the state. But do you see any mechanisms that can be created or any way to take concrete steps to actually improve the situation and make it stable enough or safe enough in Kashmir for the Pandits to be able to return there and bring general security to the region?
Yes, the answer is in getting the state to do what it is supposed to do. Carry out its responsibility in terms of enforcing law and order, and stop making deals, political deals, with those who it is supposed to punish. Now, it's easier said than done, probably. How do you shame a state that deals with genociders through negotiation? It isn't such a complicated issue, is it? But we need to find a mechanism to grow political will among those who manage our situation. And I think one way of helping them grow that will within is to unequivocally delegitimize what is happening in the name of a struggle or a movement. Identify very clearly the goals that are being pushed in the name of freedom, which is such a exalted word. But you just have to scratch the surface a little, and it'll tell you that we are looking for an order which is based on Sharia, which has no place for minorities under its dispensation, and which is seeking not a constitutional change in terms of rights, but it is seeking to abrogate a constitution which is most liberal to a fault. I must tell you, this entire movement is not about a specific right. It is not about seeking to change the constitution in a manner that would give them more freedoms. No. It is about abrogation of a constitution which is man-made and replacing it with a God-mandated system. And freedom to do so at the expense of the minorities of the state. Now, if a state gets down to deal with it by, we will not talk to you kind of sulk. You are a medieval organization which doesn't believe in our constitution, so we don't recognize you, we will not talk to you. If a state goes into that sulk, it suits them because they are let loose and free to do what they wish to do. Instead, it's supposed to come like a ton of bricks on them and say you're indulging in sedition, you want to break this country, you hounded a minority out of this place, you patronize violence, and that cannot be allowed. Now, instead of all that, what we see our prime ministers doing for the last 25 years, one prime minister in '93 said, everything is possible and sky is the limit. Sky is the limit is what was promised. As in, you ask us, you make demands, and we will see what we can do within this constitution, and even if it doesn't permit, we will creatively interpret it to give you something. Was the promise of one prime minister. Another prime minister said, and I'll quote the words as Jamhuriyat, Insaniyat and Kashmiriyat. Under these three terms, Jamhuriyat is democracy, Insaniyat is humanity, and Kashmiriyat is what passes off for their identity. Under these three, we can do anything for you. So tone and manner, everything about the body language is that we want to make a deal with you. Nobody wants to tell them that these are the red lines. You dare not cross them. You cannot indulge in violence, you cannot kill, you cannot maim, you cannot take hostages, you cannot burn down property, you cannot call to arms. Nobody is laying that down as inviolables in no uncertain terms. So when a state that is tasked with dealing with it firmly comes down to capitulation, you can only hope and pray, or probably migrate.
And have you seen any differences in how the current administration at the center has handled the situation versus previous governments, or is it the same lack of political will?
The present central government?
The present central government.
You want me to open a can of worms? I mean, the present central government has become a party to the coalition that is running the state 2 years ago. And the so-called agenda for alliance that they drew in, which were the terms of engagement in order to be part of that government, is a document that lays bare an absolute surrender, the line prostrate. For example, since their founding in 1950, one of the key principles on which they formed this political party was that we shall repeal Article 370, which creates a barrier for our parliament, the most sovereign body in the country, has no jurisdiction in that state to make any laws. It can make laws for every square inch of territory of India, but it has limited its jurisdiction vis-a-vis the state of Jammu and Kashmir, cannot make laws. And that comes in the way of full integration. It not only doesn't make its laws for that state, it also prevents the free run of Indian constitution in that state. Fundamental rights that are enjoyed by the rest of the Indians are not there guaranteed. I'll give you two examples, in fact three. In 1988, the Parliament passed a Prevention of Corruption Act. It isn't applicable in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Are the politicians, bureaucrats, lily-white in the state of Jammu and Kashmir and don't take a penny out of public coffers? Sorry. The same year, there was another law, which was Prevention of Misuse of Religious Places and Institutions Act, where you could not use temples, mosques, gurdwaras, or churches for stockpiling arms and ammunition or using them for political activities. Doesn't apply to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And what happens? Mosques have become the center for mobilizing people who come and pelt stones at the security forces who are engaged in an encounter with the terrorists to help them run away. You see? Those rights to information, which is a fundamental right passed by the Parliament of India, wasn't applicable to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So, this particular Article 370, the party was sworn to repealing in order to get into the coalition on 1st of March 2015. It gave it in writing that we shall not touch the special provisions in the Constitution of India that keep the state of Jammu and Kashmir outside the purview of Indian Parliament and give them some special privileges. 2, it said we will talk to all stakeholders, including Hurriyat, which is the separatists and who are the patrons of terror organizations like Hizbul Mujahideen or Hafidul Ansar. We'll talk to them, we'll deal with them, we'll negotiate with them, is what they promised. There were several other concessions that they gave which are horrifying. For example, 18th of July they drew a line vis-a-vis Pakistan. When Pakistan was going to send their foreign secretary for talks, the Pakistan High Commission called Hurriyat for briefing them on what the talks are going to be about. Government of India, for the first time, told Pakistan, if you want to engage with Hurriyat, you don't engage with us, and called off those talks. We were jubilant. For the first time, we have a leader and a party with political will and spine to stand up to Pakistan and draw some red lines. For next 8 months, India behaved as if Pakistan did not exist. This coalition in the state forced this government to make an about turn on that policy. The Prime Minister was forced to pick up the phone and talk to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and resume dialogue. Thanks to this coalition coming in. So if such is the level to which compromises can be struck, concessions can be given, I wonder where all will it end? And we need to take a fresh look at what to expect from this government. This is, besides the point that this government is probably the best ever in decades we've had. And there is nobody else on the horizon where we can pin our expectations. So it hurts to not be hopeful and optimistic, because we don't have an option. I hope you understand our predicament. We invested a great deal in this leadership and this government, and we're still hoping against hope that something good will come out of it. But the present signs and whatever is being done doesn't point at a direction that could call for such optimism.
Thank you, Sushil, for that. We've got time for just a couple more questions, and then we're going to have our panelists give their final closing thoughts. Seth, you talked about the various definitions of terrorism and what you consider to be acts of terrorism versus what is perhaps in common parlance considered terrorism. If you were to give an ideal definition of terrorism, what would that be, number one? And number two, why is it important to define it in that manner?
I actually think that the definition that Anita read from the Department of Defense about radicalization is at least an excellent place to start. I think that that is good. And the reason why is it gets to some fundamental elements. One is it's generally applicable. There is I think for a lot of people in the West, there is a tendency, I don't see any reason not to pretend this isn't true, to equate terrorism think that it must mean Islamic, right? But that's not true. There are cases in the U.S. of Oklahoma City with a terrorist attack, had nothing to do with Islam. There could be religious terrorism from all religions. There are terrorist Christians, there are terrorist Jews, terrorism knows no religion in that respect. Terrorists often do know religion, so I think that we also can't pretend that that's not the case. But the other reason is that it gets to some very important fundamentals. It involves violence to make social or political change. Non-state violence to make social or political change. Where I run into arguments about something that is or isn't terrorism, that meets those criteria, it tends to be because the person carrying out the act is from the in-group of the person making the perception. So, for example, in Pakistan, the governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer, was murdered by his own security guard, who said that he killed him because he was a blasphemer. More technical sort of situation, that he was defending a woman and I guess was a blasphemer by proxy. This fits some elements here. You have an act of non-state violence. It was carried out with a specific intention, which was to violently demonstrate that a particular ideology was protected, and to, in a vigilante way, enforce a particular set of laws in Pakistan. There is a large cohort of Pakistanis who, every time I bring this up, will argue with me, he's not a terrorist. He was a murderer, yes. And I think he was wrong, but it's not terrorism. Now, I always respond and I say, you don't have to take my word for it. The Supreme Court of Pakistan said he's convicted of terrorism. And they say, no. This is politics. It's not terrorism. He just did a wrong thing. He was just devout. He was just devout. So the reason I like the DoD definition, and the FBI has a very similar one that they work from. I like these because they're not specific to any particular ideology. They're not about beliefs. One thing I like about this country, you're free to be a jerk, right? You don't have to go far to find one.
You looked at me when you said that. I was looking internally.
I think that everyone, as we go through life, we think stupid things. That's part of changing. A former ambassador from Pakistan, you may have heard of, Hussein Haqqani, is often attacked by people who say, but when you were a teenager, you were a Jamaati. So how do you come now and tell us that? And I heard him one time give the best, I've stolen it, I use it myself all the time. When people say, somebody said, how can you do this? And he said, when I was an infant, I wore diapers. I don't wear diapers anymore. People evolve. You grow up. These definitions that DoD and FBI have, they allow people to make mistakes, but they don't condone acts of violence.
Yeah, if I could just pile on.
Yeah.
I think another reason why it matters in the global context is really understanding the networks and the dynamics. So if you look at Afghanistan, for example, the Afghan Taliban, I think globally are seen as terrorists. They're not a designated terrorist, an FTO. they're considered an insurgency by the DoD and others that are working the Afghan problem instead. Because they are a nation, they're a network that is acting against the government in hopes of actually controlling the state of Afghanistan, and they've had power before. So that's sort of where we differentiate that. They use terrorist tactics, is what you'll hear. So yeah, it can get very muddy, but there are reasons for these definitions.
Well, I think with that, I want to give a chance to our panelists to just give a few minutes of closing remarks. Anita, why don't we go ahead and just start with you?
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for having me. I would just like to say, from working in government, these issues, radicalization and terrorism, insurgency, and the like, are something that is on the forefront of American policy. And when we look at South Asia, that's a key and very important region for how we move forward with American foreign policy. When we look at our relationship with India, as we all know, is strong, and I think from when I talk to other people in government and other officials and foreign policy, think tankers, etc., that is a relationship that is going to continue to grow, and it is in a positive direction. So I think we want to just keep that in mind and always focus on that. That said, we always try to work and ease out the tension. Some of these issues are going to take a very long time, and Afghanistan, as we know, has been an ongoing issue, and Pakistan. But I do see some hopes for positive change. With Pakistan, I think it was mentioned before, policy hasn't been that great, but we're seeing slowly some gradual changes. The Coalition Support Fund, hesitancy or withdrawal to provide coalition support funds is a starter. But you're going to have so much ebb and flow when it comes to these policy dynamics. But it's definitely a region that we will continue to watch out for, and I do see the growing relationship, as I said again, with India being one of the key positives as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Sushil?
Thank you, Anita. In fact, that's where I would like to start. I feel that US has done too little and probably quite late into getting into a situation of impacting the ground in South Asia. On Pakistan, the issue, it still seems a little iffy. There is a back and forth kind of movement. There was a time when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said that you can't raise snakes in your backyards. And also probably it was during her tenure that she declared a bounty on Hafiz. Nothing came of it. He goes around in public spewing venom, recruiting people, raising funds, and sending terrorists. As routinely as you take out Haqqani network operatives in Pakistan, I thought he was an easy picking for US, but that hasn't happened. Likewise, on several other fronts, there seems to be a policy which doesn't act decisively, resolutely, in order to punish the state of Pakistan for continuously using terror as a part of its foreign policy. Even with the Western neighbor in Afghanistan, it is not just our consulates which are getting attacked regularly. They routinely strike in the capital, across buildings, the security forces, and now even on the border, with skirmishes happening. So there's so much more left desired to be acted upon by the US that isn't happening, and I only wish that if there is some more decisiveness on the part of US in the region, probably other states would get courage from there and move in that direction in a coordinated manner. and put a lid on it, deal with it more effectively. But if there is hesitation and indecision stemming from here, then it gives mixed signals and it creates opportunity for all kinds of groups that continue to operate there in impunity.
Thank you, Sushil. Seth, do you want to round out the final remarks?
Sure. And I would just, I would conclude by saying, the fact that you're here means that you are already more engaged and more knowledgeable than a lot of people, most people. I understand tomorrow, I believe, is the Advocacy Day. You're going to be doing meetings. This is critical. Earlier, the earlier panel talking about human rights, and there was a discussion about discussion about reaching out to the police and reporting hate crimes and things. And there was the talk was, they were talking about an incident where they said, well, the police, you never called us. We didn't know that this was going on. Remember when you do Advocacy Day, when you do the meetings, when you call, the people who you're meeting with, they're not just responsible for human rights. They're not just responsible for foreign policy. They're juggling tax code and transportation and energy and everything else. If you don't tell them, they're not going to know. It's up to you to get them to pay attention. Don't think that you're not expert enough. You probably know more than the person that you're talking to about these issues. And if you keep pressure on them, then that's how things change. There's been a lot of talk up here about government inaction, about not knowing, about lack of information at different state agencies and the public. But it's our responsibility as citizens to be able to fill in that gap. So go forth, have a great Advocacy Day, and working together, we're going to get rid of the isolation that Anita talked about.
Thank you very much. We'd like to thank all our panelists again for a wonderful discussion and dialogue. And now we have a few final remarks from Jake and Sarah.
I want to thank everyone again for coming to our second annual Advocacy Forum, and we hope to repeat this program again, make it better for our participants and for the audience members who are watching us live from Facebook. And it's really a pleasure to have all of you here today. As we conclude, I have a few announcements. Number one, we have a reception tomorrow evening in this room, actually, in 2044 Rayburn, 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. And I recommend that you all come. It's kind of our keynote event of the year here in Washington, where we celebrate the contributions of all our delegates and the Hindu American community to our advocacy efforts. And then on Wednesday morning, 8 to 9 a.m. in 2168 Rayburn, we're celebrating International Yoga Day on June 21st, Wednesday morning. So if you want to relax between committee meetings and constituent calls and all the other things you have going on in your life, we'll be doing a desktop yoga session. And then finally, we have, for our delegates, we have a Capitol Hill tour scheduled, and time is actually of the essence because you have to be in the security line no later than 3:30 in order to get through. So what I ask is for all our delegates who have already signed up to please just grab something to drink, maybe a little snack if anything's left, and then head straight there. We have staffers from the offices of Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy and Pramila Jayapal, and they will be escorting you all through the Capitol. And again, if you've already signed up, I think we have about 10 to 15 spots left, so if anybody still wants to join, they're welcome to. But other than that, at 3:10, actually, I would like everybody to meet at this door, or right outside of it, and we'll proceed from there. And
thank you all for joining us again, and for delegates, you have to be back in this room by 5:30 for our orientation, just to prepare for tomorrow's advocacy delegation. Thanks again.